Hello, I'm Hannah Owens, the Director of Groups and Intensives at the Refuge Center, and I'm here today to talk to you about how, from a mental health perspective, we can individually and collectively respond in an effective and healthy way to crises that occur in our community, whether that be neighborhood, school, city, or state. So, what is a community crisis? That's not the slide that I want. Went away. Okay, I don't have the slide. But what is a community crisis? The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services defines it as an event that is large scale in impact, takes a toll on human life, includes uncertainty, and is complex. We usually respond to man-made disasters more strongly than to natural disasters, especially if they're targeted and intentional. Each community tragedy has a lot of ripple effects, and victims of tragedies in particular are at a higher risk for long-term mental health issues. To top it off, crises like this often expose existing community problems, whether in social systems, infrastructure, or elsewhere. By that definition, I think we've experienced our fair share of community crises in recent years. The March 2020 tornado, the pandemic, social unrest after George Floyd's death, the bombing in downtown Nashville, and the Covenant School shooting. As I begin this presentation, I want to distinguish between a response and a reaction. A reaction is an action that follows a stimulus, like when you're at the doctor and he whacks your knee and it kicks. No thought, just action following a stimulus. A response is defined as an answer, to give a reply to something. My hope in this presentation is that we could become aware of our reactions to community crises and that we could develop options for effective responses as well. Although our immediate fear or anger-based reactions are normal, they're not always the most helpful, especially in the long term. So let's start by getting an idea of what our knee-jerk reactions to stress are. First, know that any reaction, there we are. First, know that any reaction to a community tragedy is a normal reaction to an abnormal event. There are a few ways that we typically respond that I bet you've heard of. Run toward the stress or challenge, fight. Run away from the stress, flight. Or get stuck, freeze. Each of us typically has a reaction that happens most often when we face stress. So you may observe fight, flight, or freeze in yourself or others, but what's going on inside? Stress, crisis, or trauma affect us as a whole person. So to break it down, here are some categories in which we have reactions or are impacted. So that first one is in our cognitive part of ourselves. That means our thoughts, how we look at ourselves and understand others in the world. Physical, that's our body's functioning, like sleeping and eating. Emotional, the feelings we're having, how often we're having them, and at what intensity. And social, our relationships with those closest to us and those not so close to us. Some things to know about these impacts or reactions, they're all connected. So I might feel brain foggy, and then I might start to feel anxious because I can't think normally. Or if I'm not sleeping well, I may be more easily emotionally overwhelmed. There is a helpfulness to the reactions in each of these categories. For instance, cognitively, let's talk about denial or shock. Sometimes to really take in the full gravity or reality of what has just happened would be too much for our systems. And so our bodies and brains do this really amazing thing that keep us a little bit in denial about it or so shocked that we can't grasp it. That's helpful, that's protective. Emotionally, our emotions can tell us how we need to protect ourselves, what we need for self-care, maybe even what we need from others. Physically, if we're having some of these impacts, it tells us how we need to take care of ourselves differently or better at a time like this. And socially, even the tendency to withdraw or isolate for a time may provide space to kind of get your bearings so that you know what you need from others for support and what you can offer at this time. Also, reactions change over time. You may start, like right after a community tragedy happens, you may feel really numb. And then a couple of days later, you may move into fear or anger. There's no formula or right way to react. All of these are normal. So just looking at these impacts can be overwhelming. And that's exactly what a community crisis feels like, overwhelming. In fact, by definition, traumatic stress that may be caused by a community crisis can overwhelm your ability to cope. In other words, your normal coping skills, whether that be running, talking to a friend, journaling, may not cut it during the period of high stress right after a community crisis. So we talked about typical reactions and how they can be helpful. Now I want to explain a few reactions or behaviors that are unhelpful. The first thing to look out for is the possibility of personalizing the experience more than is appropriate. For instance, you may play the tape of the tragedy in your head and imagine yourself as a victim in order to figure out how you'd protect yourself. This is called vicarious rehearsal. At first, this might seem helpful in reducing feelings of uncertainty, but if this thought pattern continues, it can be really disruptive because it can create more fear and anxiety. The second tendency to watch out for is the stigmatization of a group of people that you've deemed as the problem. For instance, if a milkman sets fire to a local pharmacy, you may start to think that all milkmen are arsonists and dangerous. When we're safe, calm, and relaxed, that thought seems outlandish because we're able to think critically, reason, and have insight. Of course, not all milkmen are arsonists just because of one man's crime. However, when you're in a stress or fear response, you don't have access to the critical thinking parts of your brain. So it's more likely that you might jump to such conclusions. These conclusions, if held over time, can become problematic for recovering personally and communally, and for finding creative prevention strategies for the crisis that just occurred. Next, be on the lookout for your personal trauma history to be triggered when you experience a community crisis in the present. Although big feelings are normal, sometimes your reaction may feel disproportionate to the actual impact the crisis has on you. For instance, someone who had a family member deployed to Iraq after 9/11 may have had intense fear after learning that Russia invaded Ukraine. That old fear about a family member's absence or safety may resurface. The connection to your past trauma may not be so obvious, so it can be helpful to identify the primary feelings you're experiencing and ask yourself, have I ever felt this way before? So if you're feeling powerless and stuck, maybe you're reminded of when your parents divorced and you couldn't do anything about it. Or if you're feeling really angry about injustice, perhaps you're reminded of a time that you were treated unfairly or bullied. When your personal trauma history is triggered, it can feel really intense because you're feeling about the past and the present at the same time. It can be helpful to sort out which feelings belong to which event. And if you can distinguish that a little bit, you can decide how to move forward and respond to the present experience and how to address the past trauma, because ultimately both need to be tended to with care. So we've touched on the definition of a community crisis, normal reactions, and reactions to watch out for. Now let's talk about what to do in response to a community crisis. I would recommend that the first place to start is with simple self-care, like tending to basic needs. Have you eaten? Have you had enough water today? Have you seen the sun? Are you breathing? Do you need to rest? Do you need to move your body a little bit? These may seem like no-brainers, but these are simple activities that help soothe, calm, and regulate our bodies, which naturally moves us out of a stress-based reaction. When your body is calmer, next you can turn to your emotions. To move through the variety of emotions you may be feeling, start by naming them. There's no wrong way to feel, and it's normal to have a wide range of emotions that change, shift, and even come in waves after a community crisis. You may not understand what you're feeling, and that's okay. Once you've identified your emotions, tell someone else about them. Although you may not be able to say much more than, "I'm so sad," or "I'm so shocked," sharing your emotions with someone else automatically lightens the load and can make the emotions feel more manageable. Once you've identified your emotions and allowed yourself to feel them, you can start to investigate helpful responses and action steps. One universal need after a community crisis is to grieve. Although we typically associate grief with sadness, grief actually encompasses many different emotions. Grief is the whole of our experience after a loss of any kind. So here's some losses associated with a community tragedy: the loss of lives, the loss of the ideal version of your community that you had in your head, the loss of a sense of safety or predictability, even the loss of how the world made sense. Simply put, the way to grieve is to allow yourself to experience any feelings that come with the loss. In addition, intentional activities like ceremonies, vigils, or rituals can help honor your loss and allow the safe expression of grief and its associated feelings. These are activities you can do individually, with your family or a small group of loved ones, or with the community at large. Can you help me move it? Thank you. Here are some examples. So, writing a letter either to the thing or the person that you lost. Writing a letter to someone you wish you could talk to about it. Lighting a candle so that when you see the candle or smell it, you're reminded of what's important to you or what was lost. Any kind of prayer, meditation, vigils and remembrances, even small moments of silence that include naming what was lost and honoring that loss. Any kind of art, music, singing, planting a tree in honor of someone or something that was lost. Just getting with a small group of people and talking about your questions, your feelings, memories, stuck points. Wearing something to remind yourself of what you want to honor or the legacy that you want to live out. Memory boxes, going on a memory walk. Get creative. The important thing here is that any activity you create, if you bring an intention to it, like I want to honor this, or I want to let go of this, I want to grieve, I want to express anger, sadness, bringing an intention to any activity makes it effective for processing grief. It's important that these activities are executed relatively soon after a crisis. Unfortunately, with our busy world and the 24/7 news cycle, many of us can unintentionally move on quickly to our normal lives. So set an intention of responding, honoring, and grieving communally within the first week or two after a tragedy. With that being said, the need for grieving doesn't expire. So if you're not able to carve out time or energy to do something quickly, do it whenever you can. It'll still make a difference whenever it happens. It's also helpful to find effective responses to fear and anger. So let's talk about fear first. We've mentioned how fear is a natural reaction to a crisis, especially if it's close to home and involves danger or the community's safety being compromised. Fear can lead to anxiety, and anxiety searches for facts and information to help us feel better. A healthy way to cope with that fear and anxiety could be thinking and talking through safety plans in the event that a similar tragedy occurs. Do you have a tornado safety plan that includes surviving the storm and safely exiting through any damage? In the case of community violence, do you have your loved one's phone numbers memorized? Do you have a trusted source of information as a disaster is unfolding? It's heavy and even scary to have these conversations. Many of us don't want to talk about it because we don't want to believe that these things could happen. And what we know is that they do happen. So planning ahead to some degree can be helpful in decreasing that natural fear. Another action step in response to fear is to confront the reality of our powerlessness as humans. We do have a lot of choice and agency in this life, but we've all encountered our lack of control at some point or another. Confronting our limitations usually takes us to our spiritual or philosophical beliefs. How do we make sense of the world when it seems so confusing? Where do we find security and assurance when things feel out of control? Who or what can I trust if the community or systems that I've trusted have failed me? These are questions that each person must seek the answers to. And the hope is that coming to terms with our limitations can ultimately help settle our fear, or at least move us from extreme worry to just plain fear. Now let's talk about anger. Anger is such an appropriate response to a crisis because when anger shows up, it says, something isn't right, something I care about has been violated. And part of the purpose of anger is to move us into action in order to make appropriate changes or to stand up for ourselves or our community. For some people, an effective action step may be to show up in solidarity with victims, to protest or to participate in other volunteer efforts or social action, whether that's in the short term or in the long term. When an event occurs that leaves you feeling powerless, it can be helpful to ask, what can I do? Maybe you donate your time for recovery efforts. Maybe you donate food or basic needs, donate money to an organization that's serving victims. For other people, it may be more feasible to have a creative response, like in the pandemic when people wrote notes to doctors and nurses or made signs for essential workers. You can write letters of thanks and support to first responders, let them know they're not alone and they're appreciated. You can contact your elected officials and express concern, urge them to take action. Although it doesn't always feel like it, there are usually ways that you can move into action after a crisis, even if they seem small. Sometimes these crises bring up more for us than we can navigate on our own or with our normal support systems. So you may want to seek professional help if your symptoms linger or get worse, if your normal coping skills just aren't cutting it to provide relief or stability, if you get stuck in one emotion or thought pattern that you just can't shake, or if you already have mental health conditions and are feeling particularly triggered. If you're struggling with the effects of a community crisis on your own mental health for more than 2 weeks, go ahead and reach out for professional help. It's better to be proactive than to try to do it on your own and let your mental health disintegrate further. So I know there are probably some parents here thinking, how do I support my kids when something happens locally? My colleagues and I received this question from many parents after the Covenant School shooting. So here's just a few tips. First, being appropriately open and expressive about your own thoughts and feelings automatically validates whatever your kid is experiencing. Stating that you're sad, confused, talking about your questions, even crying, can be helpful. Don't try to have all the answers or explanations. Instead, say, I don't have the answers yet, but when I do, I'll tell you and we can talk about it. Maybe you say, maybe you answer simply and honestly, and don't make promises that you can't keep. Like, this will never happen again, or this won't happen to you. Instead, you can tell the truth, which might sound like, just like now, whatever happens, I'll be here for you, and I'll do everything I can to keep you safe, whatever's going on. Your job is not to fix any feelings that your kid is having, but to help them experience them in manageable ways, which ultimately means not leaving them alone in their feelings. And kids are so creative and resilient, so ask them how they'd like to express their feelings or how they'd like to commemorate what was lost. Although the first week or two after a crisis may feel like the world's upside down, this is a time to stick to routines and norms that help the family feel a sense of predictability. An important note here is that it's okay and often necessary to take a break from difficult feelings, continue to do things you enjoy, even intentionally engage in activities that create smiles and laughter. So consider an impromptu dance party, tell each other jokes, etc. For adults and teens, this may mean taking a break from social media or watching the news. Usually, after a crisis occurs, the true need for information diminishes once you know that you, your people, and the community at large are safe. Research shows that after 9/11, the more media consumed increased the risk of PTSD, even for those who weren't direct victims. If and when you do consume media or information about the tragedy, bring your attention to the kind, human responses of the community. The purpose of this isn't to deny the reality of the atrocity, but to fill out the whole picture. That usually when tragedy strikes, humans show off their best qualities to help each other survive and recover. And now a note for the mental health professionals and helpers in the room. It's rare that I am in the middle of the exact same challenging experience as a client I'm working with. But community tragedies have a way of overlapping our experiences for a time. And it is so wild. It is weird. For instance, I've got someone sitting in front of me during COVID trying to figure out how to gather safely for the holidays with relatives. And I'm thinking, yeah, same. So my best advice is just to be a human. That way you can say, yeah, this is hard and it isn't simple. What do you think is best for you? Next, lean on your community of colleagues. Talk about the discomforts and difficulties of being in the same experience at the same time as the people you're sitting with. Seek wise counsel or supervision when needed. And tend to your own basic needs and self-care. Give yourself grace when you don't feel like you have as much to give, or when you don't feel like you're on top of your game. Even in a time like this, the best gift you can give the people you're sitting with is your benevolent presence. Now, how can we be proactive as a community for when tragedy strikes again? There's this really interesting research that came out following the 2005 Hurricane Katrina and the 2011 earthquake in Japan. The research showed that trusting, well-connected, and cohesive communities have a lot of resilience. They seem to weather tragedy better and have less negative impact than communities who are not connected. The research showed that mutual aid, like just helping a neighbor out, and communal action led to better decision-making to handle a crisis. In fact, it's the breadth and depth of relationships that assist relief efforts most. Although this seems like a big idea, this can be as simple as knowing your neighbors' names and generally what their lives look like. Where do the kids go to school? Who works in the family? Do they ride the bus? Do they have pets? Etc. This in turn builds empathy for our neighbors, which makes us more inclined to help and support as we're able. More effective response and better resilience after a community crisis, according to this research, is a result of community members themselves building cohesion, not government or civil officials creating it for them. This creates an experience of holding and responding to a crisis together instead of siloed in our own homes and families. So I just told you how we can prepare and build cohesion as a community, and now I want to show you. So can I first just get one volunteer to come up and help me for a minute? You don't have to talk, you just have to do. Okay, come on, yeah. What's your name?
My name?
Uh-huh.
I'm Sam.
Hey, Sam, thank you so much. So, Sam, we have here a community crisis. The effects, the impacts, it's just happened and we're all freaking out. So I want you to hold this. I want you to pick all this up and hold it. You got a plan. Okay, wow, okay.
I want 6 kids. I'm just like,
She said I have 6 kids. I know how to do this. So tell me what this feels like. What are you noticing in your body?
out of breath a little,
I'm out of breath.
because I have to like figure out how to juggle it.
Yeah. You got much mobility going on?
Heavy.
It's heavy.
Yeah.
So you can kind of do it. How long do you think you could hold this?
Depends on what's risk. What's at risk.
Okay, yeah, fair. Like I'll do this as long as I have to, as long as I can. Yeah. What would it be like to have some help? You want to try it?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I have like 2 or 3 more people come up here? Please. Yeah, come on. What's your name?
Sarah.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks. Ooh. Exciting. Not yet.
I'm a social worker.
Oh, you know also. Wow. Look at this. Okay, so please drop that, Sam. All that, please. Yep. Okay, so a community tragedy has just occurred, and it's impacted all of you. I want you to pick these up and hold them together. Yeah. Now, what does this feel like?
Not as heavy.
Not as heavy. What did you say?
Pretty easy.
Pretty easy, like it's doable. Yeah,
Way more manageable.
it's way more manageable.
Supportive.
Like you feel support. She's got her hand helping you. Yeah. So this is what it can look like to respond well and together to a tragedy, is that it's still going to be big and clunky. It's still going to hurt. It's even going to be messy. And at some point, they might have to negotiate how they're holding this. Like, this is getting too heavy for me. Can you take a little more weight? Or, yeah, I'm feeling strong today, so I can take more. And it's manageable and more sustainable together. So give them a round of applause. Thank y'all so much. So, in sum, when we experience a community tragedy again, let's slow down and notice what's happening for us. Let's commit to simple self-care and supporting those closest to us in the same efforts. Let's talk and listen to each other in all the emotions and confusion of the first few days. Let's be honest and responsive to our kids who are also having a big experience. Let's find ways to act that are helpful for us and for others. And in the meantime, let's chat with our neighbors, whether geographically or in collective spaces, and ask simple things like, what's your favorite color? We're now going to take a 15-minute break, and we'll see you back then.